And along with I-940 also were new training requirements around, for instance, de-escalation. So that has been implemented and is being implemented. But clearly what we're seeing in the last couple of weeks demands additional reforms.
Hi, I'm Scott Leadingham. Thanks for joining us here in the unique Northwest. Do you remember January 11th? I know that was a long time ago at this point. There's been a lot that's happened since then, but January 11th was the day that the Washington State Legislature convened for the 2020 legislative session. It was supposed to be a short 60-day session so they could all go home and start campaigning in this election year. Well, a lot has, of course, happened since then, and they might be coming back for a special session before the election to deal with many things that are now on their plates and on our minds. And someone who doesn't cut things short ever is Austin Jenkins from the Northwest News Network, who's here to join us and tell us about what's going on. Thanks for joining us today, Austin.
And thanks for having me, Scott.
So, Austin, let's begin with, I guess, seemingly the obvious question. What are the chances that there will, in fact, be a special session of the Washington State Legislature here over the summer or before November? And if so, what will they discuss?
I think the chances are good. We had thought there was an outside possibility of a June special session. That is looking much less likely at this point. I think a special session in August or September is certainly possible. It's also conceivable that they would wait until after the November election. But at this point, I'm betting on a special session. The timing, though, is still up in the air. As for what they would be discussing and dealing with, that's part of what decides the timing. Is they like to come in with an agreement, with a set agenda, in a sense that they can move quickly to pass bills. They don't want to just open up a Pandora's box. So certainly some budget cuts would be on the agenda, and potentially also some revenue or tax options. That's something Democrats have been talking about. There might be interest on the part of lawmakers in helping the governor decide how to spend federal stimulus money. Right now, that's sort of in the hands of the governor. So maybe more legislative involvement there. And then there's no doubt going to be some policy decisions and issues around the pandemic response where the legislature, it makes sense for them to step in. And that might be around some of the proclamations that the governor has been issuing and renewing. But over the next couple of months, I think they're going to be trying to figure out what does that agenda look like, what can they agree on, and what could they do fairly quickly.
So, Austin, a lot of state agencies, state employees, schools, universities, they are all probably eagerly awaiting, in some ways, July 1st, which is the end of the fiscal year previous and the beginning of the new fiscal year, sort of like when the new budget takes effect. So that budget has already been set by the legislature, but now things might need to be changed, budget cutbacks or rollbacks or those sorts of things. As we stand now, as we're recording this, June 10th, what sort of things has the governor and the legislature sort of talked about or proposed in terms of anticipating potential big budget shortfalls?
Yeah, and Republicans who are in the minority have been urging a special session now, in part because there's about $1 billion in new spending that takes effect July 1. At the same time, the legislature and the governor are going to get a June revenue forecast sometime next week that is likely to show the state losing $7 to $10 billion in revenues over the next few years. So a looming crisis at the same time state spending is about to tick up. So, and embedded in that spending are state employee pay raises, 3% pay raises. Republicans, again, have been saying those shouldn't go into effect for the time being. The Democrats are inclined, I think, to leave those in place. So there's really nothing that the legislature or the governor are going to do to stop that spending from taking effect unless they come into session in June, which again, it doesn't look as likely. So in the meantime, what the governor has already done is he vetoed some spending in April that the legislature had passed, supplemental budget spending, about $235 million in vetoes in April. The governor has issued directives to state agencies to stop hiring, to stop signing personal service contracts, to stop buying equipment. And the governor has also directed state agencies to model 15% cuts to try to get a look and a sense, and in some respects, I think, scare people into what that level of cuts might look like. All the while, Scott, they're waiting to see if and what Congress might do this summer by way of some sort of state bailout package.
Well, of course, Austin, we would be talking about coronavirus and all of its many impacts, regardless of what's going on currently. But of course, what's going on currently, in addition to all of the coronavirus issues, are the protests and calls for racial justice and major systemic changes in a lot of ways that have popped up, frankly, just in the last few weeks. Of course, those concerns are not new, but they've really been ignited in a lot of ways by the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis. So I just wonder, as we go into the next legislative year, this possible special session, what sort of topics might be on the agenda in that arena? And let's remind, of course, there's been a lot of calls for police reform, these sorts of things at the state level that you have covered in the recent past. Can you maybe talk about some of those things over the last few years in the state of Washington?
Yeah, going back to 2018, Washington voters approved Initiative 940 that changed the threshold or the definition of when lawful deadly force is permitted on the part of a police officer. Prior to that, we had what had been described as the most generous or lenient or highest bar, if you will, for an officer to be found to have unlawfully used deadly force. There was sort of a two test for the prosecutors to look at. One was that they acted in bad faith and with malice. So that was a very high bar. And the result was that police officers rarely, if ever, were prosecuted in deadly force cases. And along with I-940 also were new training requirements around, for instance, de-escalation. So that has been implemented and is being implemented. But clearly what we're seeing in the last couple of weeks demands additional reforms. The governor has now said that he's putting together a new work group or task force that will come back to the legislature with proposals either later this year or certainly for January. But already the governor is saying that there needs to be a new state level system or structure where these instances of police killing or seriously injuring somebody could be independently investigated and prosecuted at the state level if determined to be the right path. He also wants a statewide ban on so-called choke holds. And the governor is also saying that there should be a state law mandating that police officers report misconduct or malfeasance on the part of other officers. Now, some departments already have these rules, but the governor is looking at statewide efforts. So this conversation has definitely begun, and I think it's going to be very much the focus of maybe a special session, certainly the regular session in 2021.
Well, and I'm sure whatever happens, you will be there to cover it and give us all the necessary context. Thanks for joining us today, Austin.
You're welcome.
And we turn now to reporter Courtney Flatt in the Tri-Cities. Thanks for joining us today, Courtney.
Hi, Scott.
Courtney, of course, these protests that we've been talking about have gone on all over the country in large cities and smaller areas, including the Tri-Cities. So Richland, Pasco, Kennewick, they have seen these sorts of demonstrations as well. It's not just Seattle, Portland, and Spokane. So what are some of the things you've seen, some of the people you've talked to, some of the signs you've read at the demonstrations you've attended in the Tri-Cities region?
Sure. So the Tri-Cities has seen multiple protests with hundreds and hundreds of people voicing their demands for justice for George Floyd and calling for major changes to policing. And overall, the protests have been very, very peaceful. There was one incident in Richmond last week where a white man yelled at protesters and then pulled out a gun. He was arrested and no one was hurt. At the time, he was a member of this group that sprung up called Defend the Tri. It was formed on Facebook, and now armed men and women have started patrolling some business parking lots. Group leaders have said they support the protests that are happening, but people I've talked to have said it's been a very scary situation. The groups patrolling with guns have made people feel threatened with the hallmarks of white supremacy. At the protests, people have lined city blocks, often shoulder to shoulder. They've chanted and laid on the sidewalk for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. That's the same amount of time that a white police officer pressed his knee in George Floyd's neck. There have been signs reading, "I can't breathe," Black Lives Matter, Latinx for BLM, and people in Pasco also held up the names of the last 100 people killed by police. And one thing to note is that Pasco has also had its own high-profile police shooting.
Right, and that's what I wanted to talk a little bit about. Let's remember, in 2015, the killing of a man named Antonio Zambrano-Montes by Pasco police sparked big protests over several days and weeks at the time. And so I just wonder, can you remind us of some of the case that happened at the time, some of the fallout of it, and what happened to the officers involved there 5 years ago?
Sure. So 5 years ago, Antonio Zambrano-Montes was killed in a busy intersection on the edges of downtown Pasco. He'd been throwing rocks at passing cars, and police were called. Officers said they were concerned that he could seriously injure someone with the large pieces of rock. And in the end, officers fired 17 times. They struck Zambrano-Montes up to 7 times. The Franklin County prosecutor decided not to criminally charge the 3 officers involved, although many in town had called for them to be charged with murder. Additionally, state and federal prosecutors declined to file charges against the 3 officers. Then, in kind of an unusual move, and after a lot of pushback, the Franklin County coroner held a fact-finding inquest in the case. The inquest jury also found that the 3 officers were justified when they shot Zambrano-Montes. The family was awarded a $750,000 settlement in a federal lawsuit against the city of Pasco, its police department and chief, and the officers involved. Then a federal review called for some big changes to the Pasco Police Department. A year after that, the Department of Justice found that the Pasco Police had improved. Some of those improvements included changes to its use of force policy and strengthening its community relationships within the community. And now some protesters have said those changes have made a difference.
I remember at the time covering that 5 years ago that a lot of the issues that were brought up was the fact that Pasco has a very large Hispanic population, close to 50%, if not over, but the police force was overwhelmingly to non-Latino. So there was some kind of an imbalance there, the police force versus the community that they are called to serve and protect. And I wonder if that element is sort of popping up at all in the current demonstrations that you're seeing.
Yeah, I think Zambrano-Montes shooting has really primed the Tri-Cities to call for change and to be ready and prepared for change. So several groups have been working hard with the Pasco police since Antonio Zambrano-Montes was killed. They say it's been hard at times, but policing reforms in Pasco have helped. Some people that I talked to said they're no longer afraid when Pasco police pull them over, and that hadn't been the case up until these changes were implemented. In fact, I was talking with one of the organizers at the Pasco protest when Pasco police cars drove past. They had their lights flashing and they honked and kind of waved in support. And she said it was really awesome to see that. But that doesn't mean that things are where they need to be. Protesters said that this is still just the beginning, and they'll be coming back and pushing for more and more and more changes, even after people move on and head back to work and school, like they did with Antonio Zambrano-Montes protests. And they say this fight for justice will just continue.
Well, it's all good information. We thank you for going out there and reporting it for us, Courtney, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Scott.
You can see more on these and other stories at our website, nwpb.org. Thank you for joining us here in the unique Northwest.